Tonight, a mosquito will land on your ankle in the dark. You'll feel it before you'll see it. You'll swat at it half asleep, mutter something, and go right back to scrolling your phone. It feels like nothing, a tiny bug, a minor annoyance in an otherwise comfortable night. You have a wall between you and the outside world. A screen on your window, maybe a fan humming just loud enough to make you forget the bite ever happened. But the real answer to why that mosquito exists, why your skin reacts the way it does, and why you're even sleeping behind walls in the first place, is far stranger than a bug bite. Because for most of human history, that same tiny insect was not an annoyance. It was one of the deadliest forces on Earth, deadlier than lions, deadlier than floods, deadlier, some researchers argue, than every large predator combined across every era of human existence. And your ancestors didn't have screens, sprays, or citronella candles. They had fire, smoke, and whatever plants they could find growing nearby. So how did they survive the night? How did an animal with no technology, no medicine, and no understanding of disease manage to outlast an enemy that small, that persistent, and that impossible to fight back against directly? Picture a cave in southern Africa, roughly 200,000 years ago. No walls with windows, no mesh nets, just an opening in the rock, a small fire, and a group of humans trying to get through the darkness alive. Outside, mosquitoes are everywhere, rising up from wet ground the moment the sun disappears. And mosquitoes don't just bite. They carry parasites and diseases that can end a life in days. For a species without medicine, without any concept of germs, this was an invisible enemy that struck at night and left no footprints. No wound to point to, no predator to blame, just a fever that came on slowly and sometimes never went away. So what did they do about it? In 2020, archaeologist Lynn Wadley and her team excavated a site called Border Cave, tucked into the mountains between South Africa and Eswatini. What they found changed how researchers think about ancient comfort and ancient survival. Layers of grass bedding preserved in ash for tens of thousands of years, stacked one on top of another like pages in a book written by people who had no writing at all. Grass that had been deliberately gathered and laid down as something to sleep on, replaced again and again as it wore out or grew dirty. That alone was remarkable. It meant comfort mattered to them. Rest mattered to them. But then researchers found something else mixed into the bedding. Leaves from a tree called Cryptocarya woodii, a plant known today to contain natural insect-repelling and insecticidal compounds. In plain terms, ancient humans were lining their sleeping areas with a plant that killed or repelled biting insects, not by accident, by pattern, layer after layer, generation after generation. The same plant kept showing up in the same place, mixed into the same bedding, in the same cave, across an unimaginable stretch of time. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Before written language, before agriculture, before anything we'd recognize as science, someone noticed that sleeping on certain leaves meant fewer bites, fewer fevers, fewer mornings where someone didn't wake up, and they passed that knowledge on, quietly, without ever writing it down. Just habit, repetition, and the slow, wordless kind of teaching that happens when a parent shows a child which leaves to gather before dark. Fire did the rest. Smoke thickens the air and confuses a mosquito's ability to track the carbon dioxide and body heat it uses to find you in the dark. Ancient humans didn't need a biology lesson to understand this. They only needed to notice that sitting near the smoke meant fewer bites than sitting in the open air beyond it. So the fire wasn't just for warmth or cooking. It was a nightly insect barrier, tended and fed until morning, watched in shifts so it never burned out while everyone slept. Some researchers, including primatologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that controlled fire reshaped nearly every part of early human life. Cooking, safety from larger predators, social bonding around a shared flame late into the night, and now, it seems, something as simple as keeping the bugs away long enough for everyone to actually sleep. But here's where the story gets stranger, because bedding and smoke could only do so much. Mosquitoes still got through the smoke. malaria still spread through entire regions. And when a disease keeps killing people generation after generation, it doesn't just shape behavior. It shapes bodies. It rewrites the genome itself, slowly, brutally, one death at a time. In the 1940s, a geneticist named J.B.S. Haldane proposed something that sounded almost backwards at the time. He suggested that a genetic mutation causing sickle cell disease, a condition that can be devastating when inherited from both parents, actually persisted in certain populations precisely because it offered protection against malaria when inherited from only one parent. In plain terms, carrying a single copy of the sickle cell gene made red blood cells a much harder environment for the malaria parasite to survive and multiply in. It came at a real cost. Some children born with 2 copies of the gene suffered greatly, but in regions where malaria killed enormous numbers of children before they ever reached adulthood, that cost was still worth the trade, on average, across an entire population. This is what scientists now call a balanced polymorphism. Evolution wasn't choosing a perfect gene. It was choosing the least deadly option available in an impossible situation. Malaria didn't just make people sick. It rewrote the survival math of entire regions, quietly, over thousands of years, without anyone ever deciding it should happen. And it didn't stop there. Decades later, geneticist Sarah Tishkoff spent years studying populations across the African continent, documenting an extraordinary range of separate genetic adaptations, each one shaped by a slightly different local strain of malaria pressure. One striking example is the near-total absence of a blood protein called the Duffy antigen in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a mutation that makes red blood cells resistant to a particular malarious parasite that depends on that protein to invade cells in the first place. Different regions developed different genetic solutions. Different mosquitoes drove different mutations, but all of them converged on the same basic goal, reached independently, again and again. Survive the bite. Survive long enough to have children. Pass on whatever helped you get there. Think about what that actually means. A creature small enough to be crushed between 2 fingers helped steer the evolution of the human genome across an entire continent. Not gradually, in some abstract textbook sense, but through millions of individual deaths and millions of individual survivals, repeated over thousands of years, until the survivors' genes were simply the ones left standing at the end. Isn't it strange that we picture ancient danger as claws and fangs, when one of the most powerful forces shaping the human body had wings and weighed less than a raindrop? This is the counterintuitive twist that most people never learned. The lion in the tall grass was frightening. The predator with teeth made for a good story around the fire, something to gesture at, something to point to as proof of a dangerous world. But the mosquito was the quieter killer, the one that worked in silence, one bite at a time, over centuries, until it had etched itself directly into human DNA. No claws needed, no roar, just persistence and time and enough repeated deaths to leave a permanent mark. And here's the part that connects most directly to you. If your ancestors came from a region with a long history of malaria, there's a real chance you're still carrying a piece of that ancient defense system right now, inside your own blood. Not a memory, not a metaphor, an actual, functioning trait passed down through hundreds of generations that began as a desperate response to a tiny, relentless insect. The war against the mosquito never really ended. It just became invisible, written into biology instead of behavior, carried quietly by people who have no idea it's even there. Now look at what's changed on the surface. You have window screens instead of smoke curling through a cave entrance. Bug spray instead of crushed leaves rubbed into bedding. Mosquito nets treated with chemicals instead of grass lined with cryptocarya, woody, air conditioning that keeps windows shut instead of a fire tended in shifts through the night. The tools evolved. The materials evolved. The science behind them became precise enough to name the exact compounds doing the work. But the goal is exactly the same one that kept people awake in that cave 200,000 years ago get through the night without being bitten. Everything from a citronella candle on a patio to a global public health campaign distributing insecticide-treated nets across an entire country is, at its core, the same ancient problem still being solved, just with better tools, better data, and a much clearer picture of the enemy. There's something almost humbling in that. For all of human innovation, for cities and satellites and vaccines, one of our oldest and most persistent battles is still being fought against an insect smaller than a fingernail. It's not the meteor or the ice age that people picture when they imagine ancient threats. It's something you can barely see, something that hums right past your ear in the dark, something you'd swat without a second thought and forget about by morning. Even the language around the fight has stayed strangely consistent. Ancient people spoke of keeping the bad air of the swamp away from where they slept, long before anyone understood what was actually causing the sickness that followed it. Modern health agencies now speak of vector control, of breeding sites, of distribution programs reaching villages that still lose children to the same parasite that shaped genes on that continent long ago. Different words. Same fear. Same insect. Same instinct to build a barrier between your body and the dark outside it, and maybe that's the part worth carrying with you the next time you hear that faint whine near your ear at night. It isn't just a sound. It's the same sound that kept people awake by a fire 200,000 years ago, straining to hear whether the smoke was thick enough, whether the leaves beneath them were doing their quiet work, whether tonight would be a night everyone made it to morning. You reach for a can of spray. They reached for a handful of leaves and a fire that needed watching. The tools changed completely. The fear behind them never did. So tonight, when a mosquito lands on your ankle and you swat at it without even opening your eyes, you're not just being annoyed by a bug. You're carrying out the oldest war the human body has ever fought, one that started in a smoke-filled cave, was written into your blood by people who never knew your name, and still isn't over.